Welcome to this episode of SAM Conversations, and this is Akshat Singh. Today, we'd be discussing how COVID-19 has affected education all in all, and we have a panel of eminent guests with us today. Our first guest for the panel is Dr. Rukmini Banerjee. Dr. Rukmini Banerjee is the CEO of the Pratham Education Foundation. Our second guest for the day is Ambassador Amit Dasgupta, who's the strategic advisor for the University of New South Wales in Australia. And our third guest is Ms. Bhavna Jolly, who is the Senior Program Advisor for Education USA at the United States India Education Fund. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Pleasure.
So today we'd be talking about how COVID-19 has affected various facets of education. We'd be talking about how it has had an impact on primary education and even higher ed. And that is why we have decided to have a wide array of guests. So let's begin by speaking about how COVID-19 has impacted primary and K-12 education. For that, I'd like to loop in Dr. Rukmini Banerjee. Ma'am, let's just begin with some of the insights that you've had on the effect of COVID-19 on primary education.
Huge topic, lots of different kinds of effects, I think. But if we had to just pick a couple, I would say the fact that schools shut down, in March, slightly different times in March in different parts of India. And in many states, that's exactly the end of the school year and you're getting ready for the new school year. And so in that sense, we didn't have closure on the end of school year. In many cases, you have end of year exams, whether it's at the school level or whatever level. And then typically in most states in the country, you enter the new school year, textbooks are distributed, and then you shut down for the summer holidays. So I would say that first chunk, the first couple of months, moved right into lockdown. So there wasn't even time for any kind of preparation. I would say people were, whether it was government, whether it was institutions, you were just sort of scrambling for figuring out how you cope in this time. And then I look upon the next set, July onwards, let's say, when actually schools open. At that time, I think that most school systems had figured out one way or the other in which they're going to begin to operate. And by September, I would say that you've kind of hit whatever is going to be the response. In the case of, say, urban and slightly privileged private schools, settled into a regime of online classes or video lessons and so on. Whereas a large part of the government school system, which is which is the kind of schools with which we work, you see that was not really an option. So in Pratham, we work in almost 10,000 villages. We had quickly moved to SMS. Now, an SMS message is just a message. It can just give you a little, maybe one or two activities that you can do. And therefore, having textbooks, having, some thought that, if nothing else, I can spend a couple of hours a day or a little bit of time every day, somebody in the family working with kids on textbooks, I think has been the big response. And everything else is kind of icing on the cake.
Ambassador Dasgupta actually wrote a very interesting article on South Asia Monitor a couple of weeks ago. Ambassador Dasgupta, would you like to chime in and talk a little about that piece about how you think moving to an online system has affected the state of education in India?
Yeah, look, I think there are two elements as I see it. One is that the schools are a feeder system to colleges and universities, which are a feeder system to either high-end research or to employability. Now, the attitude towards online education is something that we might like to explore a bit. Now, what the pandemic did was, in an abbreviated manner, they made us leapfrog and embrace online education. Now, this has two significant challenges to my mind. One is the non-availability of internet and broadband and high-speed network connections, and the fact that there is an economic divide, which does disadvantage people from a particular income group. So the whole issue of leave no one behind which is, I suppose, the thrust of education for all, is significantly challenged. The second problem I find with online education is one of perception. Many people in India still continue to believe that online education is nothing but a correspondence course, which it isn't. And the lack of receptivity to this is principally because we never really embraced online education before.
Absolutely. And one of the significant challenges that international students have been facing, as you said, Ambassador Dasgupta, is particularly related to universities not holding exams and classes synchronously. So there is a lot of suffering in terms of the time difference that students have to face. But let's discuss a little bit more about the domestic landscape in South Asia before we move to higher ed abroad. Sir, of course, you pointed out to several problems that online education has kind of made more visible. One problem that has, kind of been subdued, is not being really talked about right now in education, is the fact that the gender gap between men and women, between boys and girls who receive access to education, at least in rural parts of South Asia, seems to be growing after digital education has been introduced. Could you talk a little to that, Dr. Banerjee?
I think that we have to really separate out, what do we mean by online education? If we mean that there is going to be there's going to be actually instructional, interaction, either recorded or simultaneously, then that really affects, at least in rural India, very, very small proportion. I think that the way that the large public school systems, government school systems, have been trying to reach children has been really through delivery of materials and learning opportunities through whatever means possible. And I don't even know, I think we need a better categorization of what all these remote mechanisms mean. I've been, for example, if you take a small area like Chandigarh, Chandigarh has schools of various types. There are schools in which there are private schools who are able to carry out 4-5 hours of online interactive as well as later recorded stuff, where you would have 3 children in the family, and the private schools completely expect that all 3 will have devices, not phones, on which they can do this. And the teachers, as Ambassador Dasgupta is saying, the teachers have, over a period of time, I'm sure what they're doing in October was a lot better than what they were doing in July, because you learned, how this works. Same government schools, there is a smartphone at home. Smartphone is with the father. He comes home at 11, 3 kids at home. All 3 have received worksheets, materials, tests. That is completely confused. Everyone is confused as to what in the WhatsApp should go to whom. You're supposed to fill it out and send it back. That's the reality. And when you talk to teachers, as we've been doing, I mean, the same process cannot work across these schools. There was a divide before. There is a divide even more now. We need to develop mechanisms that can help in whatever way to, even compensating, supplementing, these are all, I think, what is possible for the second family, and therefore, how can we maximize on that?
No, absolutely. And the part about the radio is very, very interesting because on one hand, we were talking about how access to high optic fiber is going to determine whether or not people receive education, and that's like a completely different take. What I also find interesting is when you were speaking about the Delhi government, you mentioned this sort of makeshift program in which students are allowed to come back, right? And this almost resembles the hybrid programs that a lot of American universities are now deciding to take. And I feel that this is an appropriate time to bring in Ms. Bhavna Jolly. Ma'am, what are some of the insights that you can give us with regard to student aspirations and expectations when they've been approaching higher ed, institutes in the United States?
So, Akshat, it's very similar to what both of our panelists have been saying. The concerns are very similar. So the primary aspect is the idea of access. When students are thinking about higher education, especially in the United States, How do they access education at a time when they're not even able to leave the four walls of their home? In fact, that is a question that students are even asking when they're looking at domestic higher ed. So that's where, I mean, it's a lovely paradigm shift. I mean, that's the silver lining of this entire pandemic, that we've all been compelled to sort of embrace or at least try and understand this online system of education. But with that comes the problem of access and implementation, and how do we address that challenge? So this physical distance that has been created, that has given rise to a lot of questions and concerns from students. How do I get the same kind of experience? Now, with international education, one of the most important factors that sort of motivates students to study abroad is the immersive experience that they get. They're looking for that exposure to students from other parts of the world, not just in the classroom, but outside the classroom as well. You would know that, Akshat, you're studying at a university in New York, and it's not just that classroom interaction that makes a difference. So that's something that students are definitely looking at. If you look at the amount that students are paying for international education, it then sort of amplifies this concern of whether I am going to get a similar experience, or is it going to be at least as enriching, if not more. And this is what US universities are definitely addressing. I mean, one thing that I must mention is, some universities abroad, especially universities in the US, have been offering online education.
Absolutely. And I am compelled to make this comparison, even though it's a little uncanny, but universities using Instagram to reach out to students kind of addresses the same problem as the government of Maharashtra using radios to reach out their students. It's ultimately, at the essence of it, it is a problem of accessibility and reaching the students. And it seems like people are innovating in the ways they would be reaching out to students. So, sir, we see that you are almost at that bridge. You have like that unique perception where you're working for a university abroad, as well as, you have a considerable understanding of the education system in India. How do you think universities in Australia are doing vis-a-vis the international student situation and the movement to the hybrid and online modality of instruction?
Akshat, I think, Bhavna did a fantastic summary, which I think cuts across many countries that rely significantly on international students. I read a statistic from the US Department of Commerce, and talking about the contribution by international students to the revenue, and it's around $47 billion. In the case of Australia, it's around 19 to 20 billion dollars, Australian dollars. So essentially, what the point I'm trying to make is that international students are extremely important. And of course, there are multiple reasons why they're important. They become ambassadors. They learn and they imbibe many of the cultural nuances. It's soft power. It adds to human capital and GDP. If wherever the student is, finally settling down working. But at the end of the day, let's also recognize that there is a huge contribution to revenue. And what the pandemic has done is actually had a significant impact on the income that universities had grown to rely upon, a significant amount of which was used to actually fund cutting edge research.
Absolutely.
And consequently, if we are going to delay the intake of international students because of health protocols and travel restrictions, etc., and then continue to rely on online education as a substitute, it has to cut both ways.
Absolutely, absolutely, sir. And I feel that you gave us like a very unique perspective as to what the university administration is dealing. We often hear stories of students' experiences and so on, but we don't really know what's going on with the universities. About the push and pull factors, there has been a lot of resentment brewing towards certain universities who charge an exorbitant price. The case in several American universities with respect to online education and physical education remaining the same is very similar to what you mentioned in Australia. So I can tell you from personal experience that at Columbia, for example, there is right now a talk of a tuition strike going on, which has picked up a lot of traction, which has picked up thousands of petitioners writing to the university president. And I feel that if the resolution of problems such as these is not met in the next couple of weeks, then it has a potential to really grow out of proportion. Let's bring in.
If I can
Sure.
just jump in here and play the devil's advocate.
Sure.
Now, while I did raise that as a significant point, let's look at subjects like physics and chemistry and medicine, etc. Many of the international universities, and I'm talking only about great universities, institutions of extraordinary repute, they have all invested a significant amount of their own funds, even at this very difficult time, to create what are known as virtual labs. So naturally, their argument really is that while it might look like are not giving you the face-to-face experience, unfortunately, our investment in online education has been so high that we need to be able to recoup this cost. And quite frankly, if you put in $80 to $100 million in being able to set up establishments like this, the message that you're giving is online education is here to stay.
Absolutely. And the investment, despite of a lot of universities losing a lot of capital due to there being bad returns on investment during the pandemic. Let's bring in Dr. Banerjee over here. Dr. Banerjee, could you speak a little to some sort of similar challenges that the government has faced and a couple of innovative policy solutions to this? You talked about the government of Maharashtra's initiative through the radio. Could you speak a little more about that?
I would say I just want to add something to what Ambassador Dasgupta said, that in India, in the elementary education field, while we may have, private schools, which everybody, when you say private school, thinks of big buildings, South Bombay, South Delhi, a very large amount of the private provision of schooling comes from very small and low budget schools. And we see a big preponderance of that in, many states. For example, in Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, almost 50%, even in rural areas, go to these, or UP, go to these very low cost schools. And I think those schools, in a very weird way, face exactly the kind of problem that the ambassador is talking about, is that the whole economy of running this, is running on very, at normal times runs on pretty fragile grounds. And therefore, in this kind of a situation, it's unaffordable really for the school, the owner to run it. So I think one of the things we are going to see when kids start coming back to school, when attendance stabilizes, I think there's going to be a big period between schools opening and children coming back. And in that period, we're seeing that already in many states where teachers are coming, but the children are not. I think you're going to see a big rise in government school enrollment because of two things. One is the private schools could not afford to remain open. And second is parents could not afford even the 50 rupees or the 100 rupees, that was needed. In the Asar survey that we've done this year, we see, interestingly, compared to 2018 or previous year surveys, we see a big, currently not enrolled in school, we see a big bunch in the 6-7-year-olds, which is, I think, the children who would have been enrolled in private schools. Parents are waiting off because you don't want to waste the fees and so on. So, and the education distribution on the lower end, we see some common patterns.
Absolutely.
I would say, innovative practices. I don't know what is, I always worry about what is innovation, but I think that, attempts being made to try to constantly figure out what would be a better solution than what we have right now. I think, we are seeing different versions of this in different states. And again, if I go back to the data that I've been citing, and I've just sent Akshat the link, because it might be useful. We see this, think about, again, I'm talking about the vast government school systems. There is a traditional textbook, printed material, and how do you distribute that, and how do you get that to the kids? And you see how do you reach them by remote, through phone of various types. And then in the middle, there is a whole thing which is visits. So visiting the school to get some information to bring back, or an older child visiting the school to get stuff to come back, or teachers. Many states, teachers are going home to home. And again, going back to what Bhavna was saying, there is an opportunity both for this engagement in a way that the normal teaching learning may have been much more academic transaction. But now, because of these crises, you're having to deal with each other's as. So we see again, this is a very big opportunity to engage, build something on which you may be able to, build something better later on. Personalized education in elementary school in large government systems is usually, you don't think about it. But now, if teachers are phoning home, you get a personal phone call from a teacher, she will talk only about your child. She'll not talk about the big problem. Absolutely. So how do you find, just a phone call you can do to 90% of families in India? Absolutely, ma'am. And I feel that government teachers acting for the benefit of students, apart from this assurance that their salary is going to come, I think it speaks to the resilience of the teachers, and it speaks to the innate nature of the teachers willing to really, go out their way and help the students. Seeing that we are almost running out of time, I want to bring in Ms. Jolly for her final thoughts on the recommendations and some, FAQs that you hear the most, some guidelines and norms that you can help the students with, followed by Mr. Amit Dasgupta on the same.
So Akshat, before I do that, I just want to kind of add to what Dr. Banerjee said. I think she made such a beautiful point, and we are talking about these changes and paradigm shifts that have been created. I was reading an article recently, this was written by a student at an American university, and the student was actually talking about how the pandemic has also forced everybody, the entire academic community at various institutions. Everybody's thinking about there's a lot of social and emotional learning that's happening. We're also, I think, forced to this shared experience of going through a pandemic has also forced everybody to, I think, be a little more empathetic.
Absolutely.
So I think that's also a very important part of this entire teaching learning experience of education that we're talking about. Another aspect is this sense of, again, I read this somewhere, the sense of creating a school family. And I believe now that's begun to happen at the school level and as well as at the higher education level. The other aspect, just to add, the silver lining to this whole thing, is also the kind of life skills that students are now learning because of this online mode of education. So managing their time better, finding ways and thinking of different ways of engaging with others. In a face-to-face situation, professors would create that for you. Now the onus of your education is also falling on you in a I think, much bigger way. So that's something else that's also happening. People who are taking asynchronous classes, classes therefore or courses are outcomes based and not necessarily at what time are you attending a class? Are you in it? Are you attending or not attending? Absolutely. It's more about what are you learning and how are you presenting that outcome. So these are also very important things that are emerging from this online learning experience, and something that I think we need to sort of take forward because we all agree that for various reasons, online education is here to stay. Now, speaking of FAQs and things that students are mostly asking, and I think I did cover part of that in my earlier response, but some of the standard questions that we get from students who are looking at international education, and I'm sure a lot of students looking at education domestically also would resonate with this. So this is, they have questions about the experience of online education versus face-to-face education, how they connect to their peers, peer-to-peer learning, are the opportunities similar. Students are also asking questions about internships. Now, that's another big part of international education, practical exposure. How can I get practical exposure if I'm not, in a particular, or in the country where I'm studying? That's another question. And there's another interesting question that's coming from students, which is, if a lot of students are not, looking at going abroad this year and have deferred their plans of applying next year, does that mean that there's going to be more competition for me next year to those same institutions? And we know that Indian students generally are very high caliber students. Even universities want to recruit more and more Indian students. US, has known this for a while, and in fact, besides China, they are now strongly pivoting their recruitment towards India because of the kind of value that Indian students also bring to the classrooms. And so, it's a two-way thing. So students are definitely thinking about all of these things.
No, absolutely, and thank you for that. Ambassador Dasgupta, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think once again, Bhavna has been so comprehensive, and Rukmini also raised some extraordinarily powerful points, particularly with regard to empathy, a sense of community feeling, and I think that's very powerful. At the same time, I also believe that education and the impact it has on the young people is what we refer to as our demographic dividend. And quite frankly, gap year is very alien to an Indian student's cultural outlook. It's something you need to do, which means you complete schooling, and after schooling you need to go to college. It's just given. It's like having breakfast. You don't negotiate on that. And so if you look at the students right now, they fall into different categories. And since we are talking about international education, there is a large cohort of of Indian students who I think are very focused in terms of what they want to achieve and why they're going to study abroad. Now, there's a large group that might decide to study abroad because they want to migrate, to become PR, so to speak. And if they want to do that, then the group of 8 universities are really not what they're going to be looking at. UNSW is part of the group of 8, which is similar to talking about the Ivy League colleges in the US. But there are another group of students who are actually looking for extraordinary good education, which gives them international exposure in terms of employment, etc., etc. They are the ones who are going to look at UNSW or any of the GO8s. Now, the question that they ask themselves is, when can I do this face-to-face? Now, I am no soothsayer, but I don't think face-to-face education with regard to Indian students, at least in Australia, is going to happen before term 3. Term 3 is September. We have, let's face it, we have over 10 million plus cases of COVID positive. And opening the borders to Indian students coming in, I think it's going to be a phased opening. So realistically, students are actually looking at the loss of 1 complete year. If they now adjust and say, well, I'll accept online education, the first question that comes to their mind is, since the Australian laws are that you need to study for 2 years full time in order to get a work study visa, will online education allow us to take advantage of this, or should I wait for face-to-face? Now, the Australian government has clarified that and has said that, yes, you can actually take advantage of this. So to that extent, it is a comforting feeling. But nevertheless, the resistance to online education continues to remain there.
Thank you so much to all the panelists for being with us on this show tonight. I hope that some of the viewers who are watching this episode actually benefit from the conversation and don't have to go through the tragic to and fro emails with their administration as I had. Take care, and I look forward to speaking with you soon again.